and welcome everyone for session. Yeah, good evening everyone. And session 31 we begin today. We continue with the aftermath of the fall of the temple. Just so last session was session 31, and we had continued with the after effects of the siege of Jerusalem, which took place in 70 AD. And after the fall of the temple, not only the temple fell, but the entire city was destroyed, in fact. Okay, and we have seen what were the effects of that, the physical as well as the psychological one. Today, in particular, we will be diving deeper into what were its effects and finally how did Judaism emerge from the ashes of the destruction of the temple and what was the impact that Christianity had to face? How did Christianity change? Okay, for both of them we have to remember, for Judaism and for Christianity, the center, okay, the center of their entire worship and their beliefs had shifted for Judaism as well as for Christianity. The destruction of the temple brought in tectonic shifts. It was a total shift, like how Judaism looked prior to 70 AD was totally different from what was finally going to emerge from the ashes. We know that collectively it is called Rabbinic Judaism, and how it evolved over the course of the first 3 centuries after the fall and the effects that it bears even now. The Judaism that we see that is practiced by the Jewish people today is a legacy of what survived the fall of the temple. Similarly, Christianity also was very much affected. It was a great calamity for Judaism, but it also proved, it's ironic to say, it also proved to be very beneficial in many ways to Christianity in the long run. We shall see how this was. Before we go ahead with this is the slide that I would like to share with you. Remember, Sister Kimberly had posed a question and she was asking what was that table of showbread, where the 12 bread or the presents used to be changed every week or prior to the Shabbat, which we normally call the Sabbath day. And this was a very long standing tradition. Remember, the whole of last session we had looked into, the supernatural signs which God had given before the impending fall of the temple, which the people at large failed to recognize. And it was only later on, when Judaism was reforming and reshaping itself, we have seen how the rabbis of Jamnia, we call them the sages of Jamnia, when they looked back, okay, and they were the ones who recollected that these things were happening. So definitely God was sending his signs by which the temple was about to fall. And this has been corroborated by other sources, especially Josephus. In that particular thing, we had seen how the temple vessels that were used in the sacrificial cult at the Temple of Jerusalem, they were carried in booty by the conquering Roman army. So when the temple fell, this was the view. This is the view of the inner court or the court of the priest. It was also called the holy place because beyond that was this sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, which was covered by a very thick curtain in which golden threads used to be woven. There was an entire big tradition and history behind, each of this ornamentation that was carried out in the temple. It was not something that, from their figment of their own imaginations, they constructed the tabernacle. This went way back into the Old Testament, especially in the book of Exodus, God giving clear directions, okay, to Moses, how the tabernacle, which at that point of time was like a mobile sanctuary, but even at that point of time, the inside, how it was to be done, was carried out as per the specifications that were given. So this is the inner view of the holy place. Okay, this was the inner place where only the priest could go, no lay people, not even the men, no women, of course, definitely could not even come in the court of men, which we have seen in the previous sessions. But here in particular, this was a sacred space, okay? This was the inner sanctum. This was a sacred space where only the Jewish priest could be there. Okay, So this was the big menorah, which was carried out the seven branched candle stand, okay, all coated in gold. This was the golden incense, okay, altar of incense, and here used to be the tables of shewbread. So when you compare, okay, the inner court of the priest in the second temple, Herod's temple, this was rebuilt after the exiles' return. This was the first temple, which is also called Solomon's temple. If you compare these both in Solomon's temple, the same three things are there. These are the menorot, it is called in plural. When it is singular, it's called the menorah. Okay, so here in Solomon's temple, you have more or less basically the same things, but the table of shewbread, this used to be called the table of shewbread or the table of showbread or the bread of the presence, which every Shabbat, these are the priests, okay, the ordinary priest who would be doing, they would be assigned their priestly duties. So whenever it was their week, to render service in the temple, they would begin first by changing the bread of the presence. And this is one of the signs God gave, that after Jesus died, this bread, which normally used to always remain as if like it was oven fresh, used to go stale, okay, 40 years before the fall of the temple. But in Solomon's temple, they say Solomon not only had one. Actually, as per the requirements as laid down in Exodus, there was supposed to be only one table of showbread and only one menorah and one incense burner. But in Solomon's temple, he had additional 10. So in all, there used to be 11 menorah and 11 tables of show of the bread of the presence. So this is it. Sister wanted to know what this is, so I thought I'll put out this picture and explain to you. We go forward now. It was a custom related to the previous slide only. I further elaborate. It used to be a custom that during each of the three pilgrimage festivals, the Kohanim, the priest, the three pilgrimage festivals used to be Passover, Pentecost, which was called Shavuot, and the Sukkot, which is to be the Feast of the Tabernacle. So these were the three pilgrimage festivals when necessarily all Jewish men and their families had to make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And we have seen that around the time of Passover, the siege was mounted by Titus, okay, surrounding the city. And that's how there was a huge amount of casualties in the people who died trapped inside the precincts of the Holy Temple and the city of Jerusalem as well. So here this used to be the custom. Okay, the non-Kohanim is a Hebrew word for the priests who were, ministering at the altar. They would hold up the 93 sacred service vessels for all the pilgrims to see. This was a standard custom among the Jewish people. So when they assembled, it was only at that point of time they could, set their eyes on the golden treasures of the temple vessels. Included among the sacred vessels were three main things, that is the table of showbread, the golden incense altar, and the menorah. All three of which stood in the Kodesh sanctuary, that is the holy place, is to be called the Kodesh sanctuary. This would be only, it would be the only occasion for non-Kohanim, that is for the lay people, to set their eyes on the vessel. The priest would warn the people not to come too close to the vessels lest they accidentally touch them and render them impure. Remember, they were very, very keen, okay, about all this ritual purity. So nobody could, actually touch these golden vessels except, the priests who were maintaining ritual purity. So the people would be warned. You see how this, priests are telling the people to stay away. They could only see, but just in case they did, an identical spare vessel stood waiting to temporarily replace the impure vessel until it could once again be made pure. And how would these impure vessels and all would be made pure? During the Day of Atonement, last session, we have seen the ritual of the two goats. One is of the scapegoat and the other one would be slaughtered on the altar, okay, for the purification of the entire nation. But apart from that, there used to be the golden heifer, okay, the red heifer it was called. In fact, that red heifer, okay, that whole cow had to be burnt, okay, complete total burnt offering, burned to ashes in such a way the ashes would be collected and kept in urns in the temple, And for purification purposes, the water would be mixed with the ashes of the burnt heifer, okay, the red heifer, and that was the way like purification would be carried out. All these things were as per what were the commandments that were laid out in the Pentateuch, that is the book of Exodus, which is part of it, the 5 books of Moses. We go on now. In the last episode, we have seen the many signs and wonders God gave Israel about the impending doom of the temple, and how, like, God was angry and he was literally demonstrating that he is no longer pleased with what was going on in the Jerusalem temple. Today, we shall explore in a very deeper manner as to what happened in Judaism after the fall of the temple and how that impacted, reshaped its core beliefs that are still held today. When you look at the Judaism that is practiced by the Jews today and compare it to pre 70 AD, before the fall of the temple, it really looks very much unrecognizable. We shall also deep dive into the conflict brewing between early Christianity and the emerging new Judaism that reshaped the spiritual landscapes of both the emerging communities, the Jewish Christians as well as the Jews. A time to mourn, they were mourning, of course. The entire nation went into terrible mourning, mourning the loss of the temple. Until today, the Jews mourn the loss of the temple. There are specific days that are, marked, especially the end of August 29th or 30th, Tisha B'Av, it is called. They mark and remember the fall, not only of the second temple, but also the first temple, which ironically, more or less it was the same time. So it was the time to mourn, but it was also a time to build. And build what? Building two separate, when you compare against the backdrop of all the history that unfolded after the fall of the temple, two communities, powerful in their own way, became two systems of beliefs and two religions in their own right. Let us see how. The aftermath of the fall of the temple. After the fall of the temple, we know that there was no longer priesthood, a new power would rise, but it didn't look anything like the Judaism that Moses had, handed down to his people. With the temple gone, there was no need for the priesthood, as there was nothing for them to do. This is very, very important. We sometimes, when we read through all the events of this chaotic moment, we just read, at a glance that the temple, the priesthood was gone, the temple was gone, so the priesthood was gone. But we don't realize that, when the Romans conquered Jerusalem and burned down the temple, they struck at the very heart of the beliefs of the Jewish people, because everything was centered on the temple and the sacrificial cult, which could be practiced only in the temple of Jerusalem. Prior to Jerusalem being the central sanctuary way back around 700 BC, during the time of Hezekiah and later on his son Josiah, they had centralized, they had stopped all the sacrifices that were carried out in other sanctuaries like Shiloh and Bethel. So Jerusalem came to be, dominating the landscape, not only geographically, the landscape of Judea and the surrounding area, but also the minds of the people, because sacrifice was only in relation with the temple in Jerusalem centered there. So with the temple gone, what will the priest do? There was no work for them. So it was like a huge void. A vacuum was created. And who filled this vacuum? We have to remember that these priests, okay, this is a picture of the high priest, okay. The high priest would, be decked up in an attire like this. On coming Sunday's session, I will be taking the last session connected with the temple, and I will be going deeper into this thing. So this was the high priest, his attire, and these were the other ordinary priests. These were probably the leading scribes and all, who were all part of the Sanhedrin, who made the entire Jewish leadership. But the high priest was the main. So this is when the leadership in Judaism shifted from the priesthood to the rabbis. So with the temple gone, the priesthood also automatically dissolved. We know the temple priesthood was terribly corrupt. We had seen that in the previous session, and that is one of the reasons Okay, Jesus had predicted the fall. The temple had gone hollow. It was no longer acceptable to God with the way things were conducted in the holy temple. It had become a place of corruption, a place of commerce and business at the cost of the ordinary people. We have seen how the temple grew extremely rich. It was also a central bank for the Jewish nation. So these were the people who were running the show, and God was extremely displeased with it, which is very amply demonstrated how Jesus, okay, took the lash and tried to drive out the people there. So with them gone, there was a vacuum which was then later on filled by the rabbis. So the rabbis come in on the scene. But who are the rabbis? The rabbis are none other than the Pharisees who doggedly pursued Jesus during his lifetime. Okay, the rabbis of Jamnia, they are called collectively, or the sages. They were the heirs and successors to the Pharisees during of Jesus' time. And in particular, we remember Rabbi Johanan ben Zakkai. 2 sessions earlier, we have, talked about this man who exerted a great influence on the minds of the people. He was one of the members of the peace party when the civil war broke out during the first Jewish revolt. He was one of the members of the peace party who was trying to reason out with the mad Sikari zealots who had captured power, and they are the ones, okay, Zakkai was one of the leading men who was trying to convince them, you know, to broker peace with Rome and accept, and sort of go in for a treaty, which they refused, and we know finally what was the outcome of it. So specifically, people like Zakkai, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, brokered a sort of peace with Rome to allow the establishment of a Jewish rabbinical academy in the city of Yavne, which is also called Jamnia, along the Judean coast. Now, this academy functions somewhat like the band Sanhedrin, because after the Jewish temple fell and Jerusalem was destroyed, one of the terms that was set was the Sanhedrin would no longer be functional. It was dissolved completely. And so, when this academy, it was granted the permission by the Roman leaders because they were a little soft on Yohanan ben Zakkai, knowing very well what was his stand in keeping with Rome prior to the complete breakout of the civil war. So, Rabbi Johanan ben Zakkai, we also know he had a very dramatic escape from the city, how he pretended to be a corpse because the zealots wouldn't allow, when in the final months of the siege, they wouldn't allow any of the people to leave the city. And that is the reason thousands of people perished of hunger and famine. So Zakkai knew very well that if he does not, escape, make an escape from Jerusalem, somehow, like, it would be a disaster to everyone. So that classic escape of his, how he managed to, hoodwink the Sikari zealots pretending to be a corpse and going over there, that is part of the stuff of legend. So this academy functioned more or less like the Sanhedrin, which was already banned. The Sanhedrin, remember during Jesus' time, that was a supreme Jewish council. It had judicial powers even to condemn a person to death prior to the taking over of the province by the Romans. The Sanhedrin used to be the one that used to even hear capital punishment cases. But when Judea became a direct province of Rome in 6 CE, that time that power was taken away. But all other powers of the Sanhedrin remained. The rise of rabbinic Judaism. Now, what came out from here? On one side, you had the rabbis who were reshaping Judaism in order to survive. Their first instinct was, if they had not to, fill in the vacuum of leadership and give direction and orientation to their crushed people, Judaism would be blown away like a candle. Today, it would be something maybe unheard of. But it was, this mobilizing of the people together, especially the person in the person of Yohanan ben Zakkai. He was the one, along with his colleagues, they are the ones who gave direction to a people who had given up, okay, who completely mourned, till today keep mourning the loss of the temple. So after, how this rabbinic Judaism, which we know of today, how did it emerge? Let us see. It all we know that this has been the aftermath, the fall of the temple. So taking that into consideration, let us go deep down and see how exactly this whole, process of gathering together that huge volume, what we call rabbinic literature, after 3 centuries, who initiated the process? It was these people, the sages at Jamnia, headed by Zakai. And what was the impelling uh, motives that drove them to do this thing? Let us go through them. After the destruction of the temple, Zakai would become instrumental in shaping an emerging new form of Judaism, especially in how the scriptures were interpreted. How could Judaism be total? How could is it right to say somebody standing and say, like when I make a statement that Ben Sakai was instrumental in reshaping Judaism, but how? Did he sort of manipulate the scriptures? They were very particular about that. They would not do that. For them, okay, the consistency of scripture was something they would die for. So what exactly did they do? And how is it that what they started made the people look very different? They did not change scripture, but they retrained people as to how scriptures are to be interpreted in a different way. All the while, the people were, they were uh, drilled, those ideas were drilled in their mind that everything revolved around the cult of the temple. Sacrifices had to be made over there because that was what acceptable to God. But now, when the temple is gone, where are they going to, carry out all the commandments that God had given them? So what they did is they did not change scriptures because they would not dare to do it, but they very systematically try to reinterpret and give different meanings to scripture. We have seen as we were going through the Gospel of Mark in the earlier this, when Jesus had a head-on confrontation with them, one of the things he accused them was the oral tradition, the oral Torah. There was no place for a concept like the oral Torah, which was introduced by the rabbis. And it was already there during the time of Jesus, but it must have been probably in a very embryonic stage. But with the temple gone, the rabbis, okay, they already had that system of meeting under the, we have seen under the fig trees how they would, contemplate the Torah and go spend hours and hours contemplating scripture and giving interpretations to that. So there was already a tradition for them to fall back on. So it was the oral Torah, the paradoxes, which they gave full expression to after the aftermath of during the aftermath the fall of the temple, when they were reinterpreting scriptures. As Rome was destroying Jerusalem, we know that Zakai made a very dramatic escape from the besieged city. But he was a man who had the remarkable foresight to understand that the temple was likely to be destroyed as well. And that Judaism, he was the first man to realize that the temple would be, it was a done deal that the temple was going to fall. The Romans, when they came besieging, they would not spare them anymore. The time for, truce terms and peace treaty was completely gone. So he knew what was coming. So he had that very visionary foresight to know that if Judaism was going to survive, it had to transform and conform to the new needs that would arise after the fall of the temple. And that is exactly what he did by providing the leadership that was needed. So that leadership vacuum which he filled in along with the other rabbis, okay, with the other rabbis, whom we normally call the sages of Jamnia, collectively remembered in history as the sages of Jamnia, they provided the desperately needed leadership for a defeated and crushed people. With the fall of the temple, there was a massive theological crisis for the people with no altar, no priest, and no way to offer sin offering. Because for the people to gain, to have their connection with God, they always had that belief that it was only through the offering of sacrifices. And where could the sacrifices be made? Only in the temple of Jerusalem. As the temple lay buried in layers of ashes, the question that loomed on everyone's mind was, how could they still claim to follow God's commandments? So there was nothing left. So there was a complete vacuum, and they just did not know how worship was eventually going to be restored with the temple gone. Zakkai and his fellow rabbis set out restructuring Judaism to focus on Torah study. So what did they do? Temple is gone. But fortunately for the Jewish people, there was a tradition of the synagogues already present, which was something that was carried into Judea by the exiles who were returning after the Edict of Cyrus. I have a slide on that, I'll elaborate further. So Zakkai and his fellows, they set out restructuring, the main tenets and ideals of Judaism, focusing on what key things, not on the sacrificial cult. It is gone. There's going to be no scope for it in the near future, at least for them. They were hopeful. Until today, they hope that the third temple will be, rebuilt by the Jews, that they will never let go of. But in the meantime, focusing on Torah study, communal prayer, coming together as a worshiping community, which actually they were already doing in their synagogue communities, and synagogue worship. So synagogue became the focal point where they all rallied together as a community to hold on to their legacy of being one worshiping community. So the void in the absence of the temple, which stood at the heart of Jewish life and worship, compelled them to turn to scriptures like Hosea 6. They fell back in order to console themselves. They started to justify that God, actually, it's not so much. Of course, He needs sacrifice, they felt, but what more He requires is mercy and not sacrifice. So these scriptural notations from the prophet Hosea, then from Psalms, like Psalm 51, where David wrote that a broken and contrite heart was a true offering, that God desired mercy, not sacrifice. These became, points of great consolation for the people. And all this restructuring of Judaism began to focus on this, that it is the Torah study. The Torah came to be very much revered. It came to be the center of Jewish life completely. Okay, so all these things forced them to fill the felt void with prayer, Torah study, fasting, and acts of mercy. These acts came to be reinterpreted as spiritual replacements for the sacrificial cult, allowing Judaism to survive without the temple for centuries. But when they proposed these as spiritual replacements in place of the sacrificial cult which was gone, they never hoped that it would be something permanent. They meant it to be transitional. But as the years went by, it became clear that the temple was not going to be rebuilt anytime soon. This new form of Judaism, fostered by the rabbis of Jamni or Yamni, became permanent and evolved into the rabbinic Judaism we know of today. Okay? Just think about, I've put out this for us all to think. Think about how hard it must have been for the Jewish people to replace everything they believed about life and worship of their God. Above all, what agonized them the most was the thought that God had abandoned His glory, that His glory had departed from the temple. Just like the vision of Ezekiel when he had, prior to the fall of the temple, he also had seen the cloud of glory, which always hung over that belief of the Jewish people was God would never abandon His sanctuary. But He did, even before the fall of the first temple. So this was a deeply wounding experience for the people. It was a big blow to them. And here it is the sages of Jamni under the leadership of Zakkai who would, direct the heart and minds of the people towards what was really important. These are some of the things I've put out over here. Okay, like for example, this is one of the things Zakkai himself, an eyewitness to the destruction, he enacted several regulations which they would call rulings, rabbinical rulings they were called in the future, which were decreed binding. For example, when they issued these decrees from the academy at Jamnia, they made it very, very, strict and very imposing on the Jewish people, that there was no way of deviating from that. It was mandatory for them. So they became very, very rigid in their enforcement of their rulings. This is one of the things that he had ruled. Priests who are able to keep track of the daily turn okay, of their turn in the temple service. Remember, I told you that there were altogether 24 contingents, and one contingent would be serving, doing the temple, serving at the altar of the temple, tending to the cult for one whole week. Then the next one would come. So in rotation, they would go all this 24 contingent. So he would tell the people, keep yourself in readiness. Why? Because anytime God might call you to service, okay? According to the regulations applicable during temple life, he insisted that the priests who were the surviving, who were already, a part of the daily Tamid service, it was called, the sacrifice, they should not drink wine on these days in order to remain in a state of preparedness and to internalize the feeling that the temple will indeed be rebuilt speedily. For the belief is deep that the events will happen so quickly that if it should transpire that a particular priest drank a minimal amount of wine, because they have to completely abstain from wine, and also having any relations with their wives also, when they have to keep themselves in complete purity in order to be pure, to be serving that whole week at the temple. So what is Zakai telling them? Keep yourself in readiness, because they will know exactly when would be their next turn. Like for example, you and I are part of one particular contingent that begins in January. So January, February, March, April, definitely your next turn will come. So, Zakai, he exhorted the priest, remember what is going to be the day that you would have served in the temple had it been standing, and impose upon yourself the same requirements of purity in order to keep yourself pure, that God might call you for its service anytime. Why was this is something very bizarre when you think about it? Okay, why would a Ben Zakai along with the sages of Jamnia do something like that? Could the temple, it was illogical that the temple will just be assembled, and a temple as huge as the Jerusalem temple, which we have seen the magnificence, its scale, how it was, would it be humanly speaking possible to assemble such a temple overnight except by a spectacular feat by God himself? So what was the purpose of such rulings? It was only to keep the memory alive, because they knew that the wounds were so deep in the hearts of the people that for them to come out of it was something very difficult. So what would give them consolation? What would give them future hope? Only that in the coming days, maybe things will change and the temple will be rebuilt. So they wanted to keep the memory of the temple and its cult alive in the minds of the people. Of course, alongside the other reinterpretations of scriptures which they made very imposing. So too the rabbis instituted various customs of mourning during the course of the year, as well as days of fasting and special prayers. Like you have the Day of Atonement, okay, it was also there earlier also, but special days of fasting were earmarked for the people in order to have that sort of unity and communion among the remnant Jewish community. So they brought about these customs. One of the most famous one was one of the famous one was this eating of matzot during the Passover time. Remember the Jews today, even today they celebrate Passover, and they have specific ways of how they commemorate that. Well, the Passover is nothing but the commemoration of the Exodus, the liberation from Egypt. So they have a very elaborate liturgy in the form of a book that will be carried out at the table, and that is called the Passover Seder. Okay, on the night of the Passover, that entire elaborate Jewish ritual in the form of liturgical prayer is carried out. And so they introduced this. These were innovative ways of keeping the whole, okay, the memory of the rich traditions of the Jewish religion alive in the minds and hearts of the people. So eating of matzot together with the bitter herb at the Seder on Passover night, the same manner in which the festive Passover pilgrims ate in Jerusalem. Also, one of the things that they brought about the changes, of course, with the temple gone, there was no sacrifices, animal sacrifices at all stop. So in the Seder, when you check what is, celebrated today currently, eating of the roasted lamb is not part of it. Okay, So these laws and customs accomplished their purpose to keep alive the memory and practice of their faith. Now, apart from this, is how they tended, okay, to the faith of their own people. But alongside that, okay, there was another challenge that they also had to be facing and meeting. And from where did this challenge come? It came from the early Jewish Christians who never felt that they were not part of the Jewish community. We have to remember that after Jesus' death, we commonly refer to that whole movement and that process of evangelizing which was carried out by the early Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. Okay, we call it the Jesus movement. So the Jesus movement was also growing. So this was a big significant challenge for the rabbis after the fall of the temple. With the fall of the temple, bridging the psychological chasm with the spiritual one, as felt by the surviving Jewish community post 70 CE, was not the only challenge the rabbis of Jamnia faced. What was the greater challenge they had to deal with was the problem of growing Christianity. Christianity was growing in numbers, and that too despite of it having been uh, declared already by Rome. Okay, Nero had already come out with the edict saying that Christianism is not a licit religion. So it was actually, practically speaking, a banned religion. Yet it was growing in numbers. You know, we often have that misconception in our minds that it was only after Constantine, okay, in 312 when his conversion took place, and after that, you know, the church began to grow in leaps and bounds. But that was not the case. Of course, it did, because the face of the Christian religion changed, because it became a state sanctioned religion. It became the imperial religion of Rome. But prior to that, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christianity. That is a famous proverb, and we have to know that even prior to Constantine coming on the scene, Christianity had already grown in leaps and bounds. That too, despite being a persecuted faith. So this was also a big challenge for the sages of Jamnia. The early Christian movement viewed by them earlier, first we know there was some sort of persecution which was carried out by the Sadducean priesthood. They were, you know, persecuting Peter and John and all these early Christians, especially the apostolic community in Jerusalem. We are aware of that, but the intensity of it was not so much. Okay, it was like, you know, something later on after the intensity of the persecution, it went down a little bit. More or less, it was viewed with a lot of skepticism, but now they began to look at it with lot of unease. And with their growing numbers, it was quickly spreading not only across Judea, but it was something that, you know, attracting great numbers across the entire Roman Empire and the known world. So with the evangelizing activity of the early church, so when we ponder upon this, it gives us a very deep insight that our early Christian church, the apostolic church in Jerusalem, was a very evangelizing, proactive church which believed in claiming Jesus because there was so much is the one who rules. So the entire Mosaic theocracy on which the entire temple cult and everything ran, through which after the fall of the Hashmonean kings, the high priest came to, you know, be also the civic head for the people, for the nation. For the Christians, the fall of the temple signaled to them that God had abandoned his people. And with this, he had demolished the entire fabric of Mosaic theocracy, whose system of worship was in its very nature dependent on the temple's sacrificial cult. By destroying the temple, God cut the umbilical cord, like, you know, the umbilical cord ties a newborn to its mother. In the same way, okay, God cut the umbilical cord of the law, this was law and the temple, that bound the infant church to the old covenant with the Jerusalem sanctuary as its center. So with the destruction of the temple, it is like God cut the umbilical cord. The Christian faith would go its separate way. Christianity was now no longer a mere sect of Judaism, but must be regarded and treated as a new religion. Conclusion. Ironically, therefore, the destruction of Jerusalem marks the momentous crisis during which the Christian church as a whole burst forth and moved into a maturity of its own, carving out a distinct and enduring legacy that ultimately conquered the world. We know that. The rabbis, on the other hand, the heirs and successors of the Pharisees of Jesus' time, they became the spiritual leaders of Judaism, reshaping it as a reformed faith. Their strict interpretations of the Torah were gathered into voluminous writings accumulated over 3 centuries from the fall of the temple. Called These writings were collectively called the rabbinic literature, and they comprised the Mishnah, the Talmuds, that is two Talmuds, the Babylonian and the Palestinian, and the Tosefta, collectively called rabbinic literature, followed by modern day Jews as a code for daily life. Though Judaism and Christianity both lost their spiritual centers, their spiritual home, for the Jerusalem church, once the mother church of the apostolic community, the loss of status was immense. It ceased to have any importance in the life of the early church. And for the next 300 years, this geographical separation of Christianity from its Judean roots quickened the church's drifting away from a predominantly Jewish to increased Gentile members. So we had, Paul had already initiated, and big number of Gentiles were already part of the church even before that fall of the temple. But after the fall of the temple, the the Christian body, okay, increasingly came to be dominated by its Gentile members, and more so when it became the imperial religion after Constantine's conversion. I think I will stop at that because it's already 21, it's quarter to 10, I think, because there are a few slides, but it will take some time. So this part I will take it in the next session, which will be the last one regarding the fall of the temple, and then we continue with the remaining chapters, the Gospel of Mark, the entire passion narrative, and the resurrection of Jesus. Any questions?